I don't know how many of you saw the press conference yesterday. I'm going to play a couple of cuts for you. But to me, the most troubling moment of this press conference was when a photo went out that showed Joe Biden holding a piece of paper that says "Tough Putin Q&A talking points" with the questions and the answers already there. For instance, the first question, Buck, that was there was, if you weren't advocating for regime change, what did you mean? Can you clarify? And then there are bullet points here. I was expressing the moral outrage I felt toward the actions of this man. I was not articulating a change in policy. It's multi-pages here, basically letting him know what questions he was going to be getting and what his answer should be, which plays in. I know, Buck, people used to want to say, oh, Trump is the Manchurian candidate. Somebody's whispering in his ear. He's not making his own choices. Clearly, Joe Biden is not the captain of his own ship in the White House. This is I believe, Ron Klain presidency. Ron Klain is the chief of staff. Biden is not capable right now of being the commander-in-chief.
Let's just compare for a moment the calls that were made regularly by the biggest Democrat news outlets in the country to remove President Trump using the 25th Amendment, which is not a I don't like the guy in charge amendment. It's this person is physically and mentally incapable. Yes. Not I don't like, incapable of doing the job. President Trump would do off-the-cuff rallies for 2.5 hours at a time where he was funny, he would talk policy, he'd have one-liners. He did this all throughout his presidency. President Trump would stop constantly and not just take questions from the press. Remember, the press walks around holding little glasses of lemonade for Joe Biden, holding little sippy cups for him. It's pathetic, but that's basically what they do. Obviously, Peter Doocy and a handful of others are exceptions to that. But in general, the press just walks around, fluffing the pillows for Biden and making sure that he's comfortable. Trump walked around. The guy they said was not of sound mind. Trump walked around and was dealing with ambushes from the press corps off the cuff. He didn't have a little note card that said, oh, this is what you're going to say. And he was slapping the press around so effectively, so to speak, in a matter of speaking. We have to, given the slap discussion, that Clay, they were constantly outraged about it because he was better at it than they were. And I just think you sit here, you say, isn't it amazing one presidency to the next, the way you don't even hear whispers from the press corps about the 25th Amendment with somebody who, just watch him, folks, just listen to him.
Let's listen to a couple of these cuts if you missed it yesterday. First, Biden says, I'm not walking anything back. Let's play cut 3.
I'm not walking anything back. The fact of the matter is I was expressing the moral outrage I felt toward the way Putin is dealing in the actions of this man. Just brutality.
So he is walking it back, Buck, but more difficult to even analyze here is the White House. Biden can't be upset with anybody in the media or anyone out there who was paying attention to what he was saying. His own White House, immediately after his off-the-cuff comments at the end, the 9 words about, for God's sake, we basically have to get rid of this guy, those 9 words immediately necessitated a White House response, making it clear that Biden wasn't saying what he was actually saying. So that's one. And then Peter Doocy, to his credit, as you mentioned him just a minute ago, Buck, he's the only guy, it feels like, in the White House press corps who's actually willing to point out when Biden is inconsistent. And so listen to him tell Peter Doocy, don't believe what you actually heard, you're mistaken.
Are you worried that other leaders in the world are going to start to doubt that America is back if some of these big things that you say on the world stage keep getting walked back?
What's getting walked back?
It made it sound like, just in the last couple days, it sounded like you told U.S. troops they were going to Ukraine. It sounded like you said it was possible the U.S. would use a chemical weapon, and it sounded like you were calling for regime change in Russia, and we know
none of the 3 occurred.
None of the 3 occurred?
None of the 3.
I mean, he's just making it up as he goes along. He'll get away with it. and the way the condescending tone to Ducey here, just because the press is all in the tank for Biden, as we know. By the way, they'll continue to be in the tank for him no matter what until it turns into we have to have a different Democrat in charge here. Whenever that moment comes, then all of a sudden they'll say, yeah, you know what, we shouldn't have. The same thing you see, Clay, with which we'll talk about later, defund the police. Now they've realized that was the press they were all in favor of this. They were all lecturing us about how the cops are racist and BLM and let's go march in the streets. And now a lot of people are dead who wouldn't have been based on the massive increase in homicides across the country, the biggest increase we've seen in recorded history over an 18-month period. Last year, the worst year in 25 years for murders nationwide. And guess what? In the Biden budget now they're talking about refunding. Now with Joe Biden, they're still pushing the lie, right? We're in the march in the streets because it feels good phase still for the press at some level. And also there's this prospect of a nuclear war in the background. So people I actually want the president to do well on this issue. I actually want President Biden to handle this in an adept fashion, but he's not, Clay. And we all know why, and it's not surprising, and we saw this coming. And they're going to keep the lie going here that this wasn't, meaning the elevation of Biden as the president, the from the basement campaign of 2020, wasn't reckless, and they weren't just being cynical and exploiting a moment of national panic because of COVID, as well as the panic over BLM and the racist police and the racist system, until eventually they decide that they actually can't push this guy anymore. There will come a point at which I think it will be unavoidable. And I think we're getting closer and closer to that now. When you see him kind of shuffling around and muttering, it's embarrassing for the country. What he said when he was over there was clearly, you have Democrats who were saying what he did was a problem. So just to be clear, folks, this is not just a partisan, everything Biden says is bad. We've been giving them credit, Clay, for no U.S. troops in Ukraine. They haven't done that. That's the right move. Not going to hit them in places where they've made the right call. When Biden says regime, when it even implies regime change as a U.S. policy, as he did, Clay, Putin is the government. He is the regime. This isn't like there's some vice president waiting to take over and everything's going to be happy and all great. And there are thousands of nukes in the balance.
Well, and that's why he was reading a scripted statement in Poland. And that, to me, is why, Buck, it is so staggeringly incompetent that he would go off script. Remember, the sales pitch on Biden is this is a guy, the adults are going to be back in the room. They're going to be able to handle significant geopolitical issues. And whatever you want to say about Biden, he seems to hang his hat on his foreign policy experience, even though he's wrong oftentimes, almost all of them, as one of Obama's own advisors pointed out. But to just blurt out at the end of a speech something that significant, those 9 words that completely destroy your previous 27 minutes, and then try to pretend. He spent now multiple days trying to explain what he meant by those comments. It really undercuts any argument at all that he's more stable than Trump would have been. And certainly, again, we've been making the argument on this program, and I think it's the number one question to be asking. And here in a little bit, we'll talk about this Harvard-Harris poll results, which I think the American public is starting to feel the same way. It's the question that nobody can answer if they are a big-time Democrat supporter. If Donald Trump was such an asset of the Russians, why was Vladimir Putin afraid to invade Ukraine for 4 years, yet as soon as Biden gets in office, he makes his move? Yeah, the answer is because he feared what Trump might do. He doesn't fear Biden.
There are some things that have happened in the last year that are just too obvious and important and powerful as really learning moments, I think, for the country, that the apparatus around Biden that tries to hold up the regime and tell us all how great it is, it's just beyond their power. What you just said, Clay, they can until they're blue in the face, they can say whatever they want. At the end of the day, it didn't happen for 4 years of Trump. Didn't even come close to happening.
That's right.
Under 4 years of Trump. Vladimir Putin, there was no big buildup. There was no head fake of he was going to, invade in the way that he has here. And the same thing you could even say about COVID. At the end of the day, more people died in Biden's first year, the second year of a pandemic, when you have better therapeutics, you had a vaccine program. More people died under Biden than died under Trump. For all their talk about how if only if only Joe Biden were president. You know, I had to deal with this. I remember right before the pandemic lockdown, I did the Bill Maher show, and the whole thing was, we're all going to die because it's Trump's fault. And I couldn't even, how am I going to argue? First of all, at that point, not a single person had yet died in the U.S. from COVID. But how do I make the argument? Because they believed it. It didn't matter that there was no reality behind it. Well, what about that argument that Biden's going to save us from the virus? Biden's going to bring back the world on the world stage. We have a massive invasion of Russia, by Russia, of Ukraine. And we have more people dead from COVID in Biden's first year than in Trump's last year, which should be it shouldn't even be close, right? I mean, you should see Biden should have had 50% or 30%, whatever. People see this. And then you add inflation and crime and the border. And we talk about border numbers later. Clay, it's a mess. I mean, you and I know it's a mess. Everyone listening knows it's a mess. But we got to hammer this home.
Well, and ultimately, that's why if Trump was still president, he was still in office, COVID would be a cudgel that would be being slammed over and over and over into him. And they would be saying, as we approach 1 million COVID deaths, and I'm putting deaths in quotation marks, or COVID deaths in quotation marks, because a lot, again, of people are dying with COVID, not because of it. But what Biden coming into office has shown, in my opinion, is that political responses to COVID were almost all wrong in general and almost no impact, right? I mean, when you really break this down, I think what we have now seen is the idea that there was any president out there that was going to make it such that COVID was not going to have a massive impact on any country is a lie. And even in China, which I'm fascinated to see how this plays out now, Buck, with them shutting down Shanghai, they've had almost no one in theory in China who's had any exposure to COVID at all. Based on what happened in New Zealand and based on what happened in Australia, I don't see how China avoids that occurring now, because zero COVID is not a continued tangible goal. And so I think China is in for a world of hurt personally over how COVID is going to spread there.
Of course, there's no political accountability in China until, well, if that happened, that would really shake the earth.
Well, that would upset the geopolitical apple cart for sure.
That would be a big deal.
Yeah.
But you would think that in places like New Zealand and Australia, here in America, Canada, places where there are still elections that have some real meaning, there needs to be accountability. Accountability is not, let's just move on to the next thing. It's, you morons destroyed lives and businesses and stole countless people's basic freedom and dignity under the promise you were keeping them safe from COVID, and you were wrong. And that means you should never be in a position of decision-making or authority ever again. That's what accountability means. It doesn't mean that you just get to go on to the next thing and, we'll see how the next COVID season is. Not on our watch, folks. Not going to allow it.
Amen.